Hey everyone, I'm Deke. This is my buddy Lewis Beard. You may know him on the internet as The Wirelight. He's an amazing songwriter and musician that I've worked with a lot, and he happens to share my love of the band Oasis. Welcome, Lewis.
Hey, happy to be here. I should clarify a little bit, though, in terms of my love of the band Oasis. It's probably different than your love of the band Oasis. I
Well,
wouldn't
you're,
describe myself as like a hardcore super fan. I'm more of a strong appreciator, I would say.
yeah. Well, you're a little bit younger than me too, so I think the era in which they kind of dropped is like, pretty important to like how much you love them or kind of, what their influence was like.
For sure. And that was something I wanted to talk about once we get through the intro portion, because I am curious about what the eras that we grew up in, which were pretty close to each other,
Yeah.
had to do with shaping our appreciation of Oasis.
Yeah. So, as you can guess now, I asked Lewis here to do this thing with me because I do have this love affair with the Gallagher brothers, Noel and Liam, and they're effectively the band Oasis. There have been many other people in the band over the years, but they're kind of the heart, soul, and ass of the band Oasis.
Well put.
Yeah. But their band was like prolific in the 90s. They produced some of the most iconic and memorable songs of the decade. I don't think anyone can deny that. And they weren't a grunge band, which is kind of crazy that whole era was defined by grunge rock. But Oasis was one of the most selling bands of that decade. And they were not even close to grunge. They were a totally different genre of music.
I think they
Um,
almost describe themselves as like anti-grunge, right? Is that the way they look at it? Britpop as a response to 90s grunge and Nirvana and that kind of thing?
Well, I watched a couple of documentaries to kind of prepare for this, and there's a quote from Noel, who's, kind of the main songwriter, kind of the force behind the band. And he says that his goal was to knock Phil Collins off the charts.
Really?
So yeah, so I think in the early 90s, Phil Collins was still, he was kind of the powerhouse from the late 80s and was probably in Britain a way more popular, probably had lots of number ones in Britain. I mean, he did well in the States too, but I
Sure.
think at that point, you know, that Noel was like super like anti 80s, that whole thing, which I really appreciate. And the funny thing is, which I think we'll get to later, is that I think Noel's newest record sounds more like Phil Collins than it does
Absolutely.
Oasis.
It all comes full circle. Yeah, I feel like Phil Collins is a much different target to try and take down than Kurt Cobain and Nirvana.
Right. Yeah. But, either way, I think that Oasis, they had a great decade of music where they just had number one after number one, huge selling records. And then even kind of later in their career, kind of like the last 5 years or so, 6 years, they still put out really good records. And in my opinion, their records started to sound good. Like they actually started to have good production, good engineers, and they had great songwriting. And Liam actually started to write more songs. And and so the sound changed, and I don't think they were doing Wonderwall kind of hits anymore. But in my opinion, their catalogs are just full of great songs.
Totally.
It's kind of why I like them so much, is because I'm a fan of artists that can consistently create music that's good, not just have a couple of songs that are, big hits with good melodies and then a bunch of filler garbage. And I think that they did that really well. And now Noel kind of never stopped. Liam, when Oasis ended in like 2009-ish, I think, basically Noel left the band, and then Oasis became the band BDI effectively. Everybody else was the same, and they put out a couple of records that didn't do so well. And Noel's solo project actually did pretty well in the
Hmm.
early days. But since in the last like 3 or 4 years, Liam has had this comeback kind of career that started where he's gotten, these producers and songwriters to work with him. And in my opinion, he's putting out some pretty kick-ass records.
He
Um,
is, yeah, and it's interesting that like at this point, I guess they've had enough time on their own to really kind of become the full versions of themselves, right? So Liam had to kind of had this false start with BDI that like didn't really work out all that well. Although I think it was interesting what he did with BDI. Like he had the whole team of Oasis, and then decided to work with some really interesting producers, I thought.
yeah.
And some of the songs that came out of there, I thought, especially when he had Dave Sitek, I think is how you say it, Sitek,
Uh-huh.
from TV on the radio. I think these songs almost sound like TV on the radio songs by way of Liam Gallagher, which is cool.
Yeah.
Uh, but it wasn't ultimately all that successful. But yeah, the current Liam output really feels like he finally has gotten the correct army of people behind him to put out what is good Liam music.
Yeah. Did you have an opportunity to watch that Liam documentary?
I did, and it was interesting. I mean, it definitely felt like a little bit of a puff piece. Like I think it was very
Yeah. Oh
pro
yeah.
Liam, very anti Noel.
Yeah.
I think they maybe mentioned Noel twice in the whole hour and a half documentary, which is really interesting because I feel like it's a major focal point for Liam and what he's doing. But we're not going to talk about that as part of this documentary. But yeah, it seems like he had some major nerves coming out of Oasis's breakup in 2009 and then BDI not doing well. And he could have very much just quit making music in whatever year that was, 2014, 2015, but decided to kind of come back to it and give it a second try with all these other songwriters and stuff. And it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah. It seems like, and again, and this is from that documentary, but it feels like that I guess met this woman who's his manager, and I guess like his, I don't know if they're married now, but his partner effectively. And I think she encouraged him to do this, which is really interesting. I think that, again, like you said, it's a puff piece. All documentaries are a puff piece to some degree, like there's some bias. But I think that one thing that I took away from that documentary is that I think that Liam did kind of get a dose of humble pie. Like
Mhm.
Liam and Noel Gallagher are probably the two biggest egomaniac musicians on the freaking planet, like,
Absolutely.
and that's kind of another interesting thing about how much I dig them is that I kind of despise that egoic, way that musicians, rock stars, like I've always kind of hated the Jim Morrison effect.
Mhm.
Everybody wants to be like a drug addict womanizer. I'm like, that's not cool. Just write good music.
But they do it
Um,
so authentically. Like they truly are these people and they are unabashed dickheads and they can't turn it off.
yeah, it's really interesting. And it's kind of this weird paradox with me because it's like, you'd think I would hate them because of this. But I kind of see through their bullshit to a degree. I kind of
Mhm.
see when you listen to the kind of music that they write and the lyrics they write and how they sing those songs, like you can't be a shallow piece of shit to do that.
Yeah.
It actually requires something deeper to do that. And I think that's what I connect with, even though I think I would never want to be in a room with either one of them. I'd never want to talk to either one of them. It would
Oh,
just
I
be
agree.
like awful.
There's a moment in that Liam documentary where he meets Chris Martin from Coldplay. And I can't imagine two more like diametrically opposed people trying to have a conversation. I'm sure Chris Martin was like, "This fucking sucks. Like I can't talk to this guy."
Right. Like I'm going to get beat up if I say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's a certain lack of self consciousness, maybe, that, um, especially in Liam's music, I feel like a lot of his lyrics in the latter day Liam output are very geared towards commenting on Oasis or commenting on Noel. And he's not even really trying to hide it. Like, it's very clear what he's talking about and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And if I were him and I were writing these songs, I think I'd try to more cleverly disguise what I was talking about than have this kind of like heart on my sleeve record out there that's like clearly about my brother.
Yeah.
But he doesn't seem to care.
Well, and I think that's some marketing, honestly. Like if you think
Maybe.
about it, BDI was kind of what you just described. It was like new producers. Noel was not a writer. It was, it was more like experimental in terms of the way the music came across. But it just didn't do very. I have a goat in my studio.
I was about to
See
comment on the
this?
goat in
Yeah.
your studio.
Yeah. My my
No big
dog
deal.
my dog Banjo has figured out how to open the studio door, which is this big heavy like bay door. He opens it and then the goats come in. So that's what's
I
going
think
on.
you've got a dog in there. And I looked closer and I was like, that's not even a dog. That's an actual farm animal that's wandered into your your control room.
Yeah. I'm just gonna let it happen for now. I'm hoping that like Sarah will get home and then come in and help me, since I'm like in the middle of a podcast. But
We'll see.
so what I wanted to say about Liam's lyrics and stuff is I think that it's kind of a marketing strategy to a degree because now that his music sounds like Oasis again and his lyrical content is this very directed kind of thing, I think people are responding to it. I think he's doing well because of the angle that he's taking. And you can look at that as an artist and say like, oh, well, that's bullshit. It's basically corporate garbage. But on the flip side, something that I appreciate about him is he says like, look, I'm not a songwriter. I'm a singer. I'm a rock and roll
Right.
singer. And in order to be a rock and roll singer, you need a rock and roll band. You need songs that do that. And he is a songwriter on almost all of his stuff, but he's not. He requires some help, where I think Noel's ego is far exceeded Liam's because of his ability to write hits. You
Yeah, and
know,
I think that's totally true, and I think that that dynamic really affected what they wrote or had people help them write once Oasis broke up. Because to a certain extent, Liam's more of a blank slate here. Like he has not been in charge of writing all the songs. He's worked on songs. He's written some stuff. But when Oasis breaks up, he's got to sit there and think to himself, like, okay, am I going to try and write songs? Like, what am I going to do? I am just a front man to a certain extent. And I think that being a blank slate there really helped him in some ways at first because he got to lean on other people and like he found interesting people to lean on through Lily White and Dave Sitek and stuff. Like that's an interesting direction for his music to go. And I think those first two BDI's albums reflected a pretty different direction. Whereas Noel, as soon as he was solo with High Flying Birds, it just sounded like a continuation of Oasis, for better or worse. Like a few tweaks
totally.
to it. Like, I mean, I think Noel, if there's any change, if there's any difference, it's that he's got more of like the word I can think of is rollicking, like kind of this like rollicking beat thing that he does for a lot of his songs.
Yeah, I think that there's more psychedelics to it as well.
Yeah.
Like and something that we can talk about a little bit. Is just kind of the history of the band in terms of band members and like players and stuff. Like Oasis always had shitty drummers. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, their rhythm section was not very good up until, the like I would say the Heathen Chemistry record where they kind of got this personnel change and it really started to change on Don't Believe the Truth in 2005 because they got Zach Starkey, who is Ringo
Mm-hmm.
Starr's son, to play for him. And he's a sick drummer.
Didn't
Um,
know that.
but I think that Noel, with his first record was like, look, now I have access to killer musicians.
Mm-hmm.
I can get, I mean, I think that I want to say like his bass player was from the Zootons.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the guys was a guy that's done a lot of stuff with Beck. He just had like this fresh band of like, really good musicians. And I think that he took advantage of that with those kinds of things you're talking about with the rhythm section,
Yeah.
being able to accomplish things in production and on the records that like he couldn't do in a band of honestly, Oasis, the musicianship of Oasis was pretty amateur compared to like the grunge scene. You look at bands like Pearl Jam or Soundgarden. I mean, those guys could fucking play. Like they were really good.
Mm-hmm.
And Oasis, they didn't really have that. I mean, Noel would pull some of these kind of classic rock lead kind of pieces, but like he couldn't play like Jimmy Page or anything. He was doing like really simple kind of Neil Young leads.
Yeah, and I
Um,
feel like Oasis kind of put themselves in a box. They created the Oasis formula, which was super successful, and they just kind of kept hitting it without expanding beyond it. And then when they finally broke up, Liam and Noel could both kind of get outside the Oasis box and do different stuff until they both kind of came around back to it in Liam's case. Like he was doing some different stuff there for a little bit, and it did sound very different from Oasis.
yeah,
Noel's stuff never sounded that much different because it's still Noel, even dressed up in the psychedelia and the expanded rhythm section. You can still tell when it's a Noel Gallagher song, or at least I can. It
right.
sounds like Oasis to me, but just kind of a different flavor of it.
And just to kind of go back here and set this up for anybody who's listening to this that's not like really familiar with Oasis, basically the band started with Liam, who is the younger brother, the lead singer, um, him and the other guys in the band, which were basically in the band for most of the early career for, up till like 2000 or so. But the band started and Noel was not in a band. Noel was actually a roadie for some, no name band from England at the time. He was like a drum tech or something. And, he was kind of like a closet songwriter, like a lot of people are. You write songs, but you're not really pursuing like an ambition of like trying to become something. And kind of so the way the whole thing started was, Noel got home from this long like year tour or something, and his little brother has this band that's like making noise, and he's like, fuck that, like I want to be in this band. And more than that, I think that, they wanted him in the band because they knew that he was a songwriter. And so really the incarnation of the band was actually this kind of really beautiful brotherly love story where you've got these two brothers that kind of do respect each other, and they're like, wow, this could be something really cool. And as Noel says in the Supersonic documentary, he says that once he heard his song played by a band, it was over. It was like, this is what I could be doing. And I think at that point he kind of said like, look, I'll be in the band, but I'm writing the songs, and I'm directing the ship. And he basically did for their entire career. He's a producer on every single record. He wrote, I would say 90% of the songs for their entire career. There were probably around 2000, Liam started to get some songs on the records. And then when they got, I think I call him Jim Archer, but I think he goes by Gim, which is a interesting name. But, and Andy Bell, those two guys joined, and they're on Heathen Chemistry, Don't Believe the Truth, and Dig Out Your Soul. And they are really good musicians who played with a lot of other like known, British like acts. And I think there's like a massive like chopper going by. Like I feel like Be Here Now is about to start. Like that's
You
like
got a
this
chopper. My dog just started barking. The doorbell just rang. I don't know what the fuck's going on.
the opening of the record Be Here Now though is like a helicopter like coming in. Yeah. And but anyway, so the kind of what happened with the band though is you had them starting the band like that, and then changing personnel over and over and over. And the history of the band is like Liam and Noel basically just were always fighting. Liam was this frontman egomaniac who would say the worst stuff on camera. He would offend people. He would talk about how much better they were than everybody. And Noel was always taking offense to that, which is so interesting to me because every time I've heard an interview with Noel, he does the exact same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no difference between the two.
Yeah, it's like they both act like that. I think Noel was maybe more concerned in the early days of trying to succeed before he acted like that. Where
maybe before he realized that like Liam's antagonism could be harnessed as like a marketing tool, because it really did end up becoming like part of the whole Oasis persona.
Totally. That's something I was going to say is that, I think if there's one band you can point to that Oasis, sounds like or ripped off or emulates, it's the Beatles. But I would say that Liam's love for John Lydon, who is Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, that's where the attitude of this band came from. That and probably,
attitude. Yeah, the sneer.
Exactly. And I think that actually really did, especially in that era, like in the 90s era, cocky rock stars were succeeding left and right. It was like, oh, you're an asshole? Let me give you $5 million to make a record. It was,
and they kept it going for such an improbably long time that by the time kind of 2000 rolls around, they're still releasing the same records and doing the same shtick. People are just like, are you seriously still doing this?
Yeah.
And here we are in 2021, and they're still doing this. Like, they've kept this going for a long time. So it's either sincere and authentic, or they're just really good at embodying this persona for marketing purposes.
No, I think, this is probably a topic I don't want to get too deep into, but from a psychological standpoint, I think these guys are so lost in their own egos. They're so lost in that world that they probably don't truly connect with like the real version of themselves. It's like, or maybe we just don't see that. I think the public facing version of a celebrity or whatever sometimes is totally different than how they actually are in the world.
And Liam says something about that in the Liam doc for during the recording of As You Were. He makes some kind of offhand comment in the back of a limo where he's like, I don't know who I am anymore, which is a surprisingly sort of candid thing for someone like Liam to say. Obviously, this remains a puff piece. Like, who knows if this is a sincere emotion or not? But yeah, he seems like he was lost there for a little bit too. And like, who knows who Liam is? He doesn't know. I don't know.
But he's got kids, and it seems like he's got a relationship with his children and stuff like that. So I think that like you kind of have to take everything you see from people in the media with a grain of salt. And I think that's part of how I'm able to like stomach their behavior. Compared to like my love for their actual music and their songwriting.
Right.
So anyway, I guess just as, time went on and they were kind of fighting and stuff, and then they would get different members in the band. And in my opinion, the record started sounding better. And I do think the music changed a little bit towards the end. I think that they were taking more direction from producers and stuff like that. They were actually trying to kind of get a little bit outside of the, Don't Look Back in Anger is basically like the skeleton for every song we're going to write from the moment it came out in 95 to like early 2000,
I was going through a lot of their like most streamed songs to get ready for this conversation, and my note for every one of those is sounds like "Don't Look Back in Anger." Sounds like "Don't Look Back in Anger." Like
Yeah.
you can hear that same descending chord progression in like every big chorus that they wrote after the year 2000.
Yeah. Have you seen Oasis in concert?
No,
So I saw them back when Lakewood Amphitheater in Atlanta was still Lakewood Amphitheater. I don't know what it's called now. I think it's like Hi-Fi Buy. It's probably something totally
I've
different
been
now.
to it since it changed. It's the same vibe, but yeah, it's not
Yeah.
Lakewood anymore.
But I saw them there, and I was close. I was in the front, and they played "Don't Look Back in Anger." They had a really good band, and it was a moment where it was like, wow, this band really did write classic songs, like
Yeah.
timeless songs. Like when I think about making records and I think about something being timeless, that's really difficult to do.
Mhm.
Any era. I mean, I think you could even take Nirvana and say like, will that really be timeless in 30 more years?
Mhm.
I don't think Smells Like Teen Spirit holds a candle to Don't Look Back in Anger in terms of just being a timeless song that anyone could listen to and appreciate.
And I think that's
Um,
partly because, I was talking about how Oasis created their own formula and boxed themselves in, but I think to a certain extent, because they were so limited, it's just like the band members and these organic instruments. They're not doing a lot of crazy studio experimentation in that era. It's accessible to everybody kind of going forward. And I think that one also is such a good example of Noel's songwriting formula. He continues to do that too on his own solo records. And I think he in particular is great at kind of creating these timeless vibes. There's one song that he had on one of his newer records that I was curious to see if you liked or disliked, but to me it felt immediately timeless, and that's Holy Mountain.
that's on
That
the
had
new record.
on the
Yeah.
new record with all the horns, and to me it sounded like this immediately massive 1960s hit where I could see people like all the screaming girls in the audience and like banging on the limo windows and stuff.
Yeah.
Like it felt like a huge song from 50 years ago,
Right.
which is cool. I don't know if it's been that successful today, but it's another accomplishment for Noel, I feel like.
Yeah, it seems like, I feel like Noel's records have kind of, because he kind of picked up where Oasis stopped. He never really stopped putting out music. And like you said, the very first High Flying Birds record sounded like Oasis,
Right.
but maybe a little better, honestly, in some
Mhm.
ways, like just as far as like the musicianship and that kind of thing. Um, but he started to experiment as his records went on, and I think that they didn't do as well. His experimentation from a commercial standpoint, they didn't do as well. But I think from a artistic position, I think that, I kind of appreciate where Noel's gone up to that record. That record, is it Who Built the Moon? Is that the name of that record? I think so.
Yeah, and the rest of it doesn't do much for me. It's really Holy Mountain that I like, and then they've got this kind of B-side cut, Dead in the Water, that's super stripped down, and that one's good
Yeah.
because it sounds nothing like all this ornate, overproduced stuff on the
Yeah.
rest of the record.
So he has a brand new song. He just put out this speaks to the ego of these guys. He has a greatest hits for his solo career, which is 3 albums.
Wow.
I mean, come on. Come
Does
on.
it have every song from all 3 albums on the greatest hit
I
album?
mean, basically, it's like a double disc with demos and shit. I mean, I know this all has to do with like trying to get out of your record contracts and fulfill stuff. I know that it's part of that, but it's like you don't need a greatest hits when you've got 3 solo records out.
No. Has he had
But
enough big hits to even justify having greatest hits? How big are his greatest hits? Like he's got some that have lots of streams on Spotify, but like how big are High Flying Bird shows right now?
yeah, I don't think that Noel has really inclined in terms of listenership and accolades. And again, I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I'm more about the art and that. But I think even in that scenario, I think that his songwriting has taken a hit to a degree because of his kind of experimentation. Like I think getting away from writing "Don't Look Back in Anger" over and over is good as an artist, but I think like kind of where he's at with his new record is some of the stuff feels a little bit flat to me. Like it doesn't have the melodic impact that some of his earlier stuff had.
Yeah,
But
I
there,
feel like he went off in a weird direction a little bit. And for a little bit there, I can't remember which album it was that he was trying to do this, but did you follow that Amorphous Androgynous saga when he was working with them to create the next Dark Side of the Moon and just completely ate shit?
yeah, it's not cool.
Oh,
It's weird. It's just, I
and it
mean,
didn't work. It seems
yeah,
like he really had these high aspirations to do something totally different, which I respect and I think is cool, and I think he needed to at that point. And I think the guys from Amorphous Androgynous, who I know nothing about, I think they were excited to work with him on doing something this experimental. And it sounds like once he was in the studio and they were kind of digging into it, he was just incapable of actually getting outside of his Noel box. Like they wanted
Yeah.
him to supposedly like record a solo 45 times just to kind of iterate on it until it was what they were looking for. And in typical Noel Gallagher fashion, he was like, "Fuck that, I'm not doing that," and like storms
Yeah.
out. And they're like, "Well, I guess this isn't going to work."
Yeah. So he does have but he has a new song out that's on that greatest hits. And it's a brand new song. It's called Flying on the Ground. And I don't know what era he wrote it in. Like maybe he wrote this for the first record or something. I don't know. But I really dig it. Like it's of everything I've listened to over the past, week or so, like kind of prepping for this, that song will not get out of my head. Like I can't get it out of my
Interesting.
head. And it's also not like it's not an unpleasant thing either. Like, sometimes you'll listen to a
I like
terrible
having.
song.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's in your head, but this is the case where I kind of go back to it on first listen. I was like, oh, this isn't all that great. And then like it's in my head and then I'll listen again and I'm like, oh, maybe there's something there. And then,
Yeah.
5 or 6 listens later, I'm like, I really like this song, and, and I,
I'm in the first stages of that right now. I listened to it a couple of times. I'm okay with it. It's got the usual like soaring Noel chorus. I appreciate that. Like I always appreciate that. It's got a lot of orchestration. I feel like a lot
Mhm,
of like saxophones and interesting instruments in the back. I think he's got female backing vocals for that one
mhm.
too, which is cool and a little bit different. But to your point, I do have literally the main line of the chorus stuck in my head pretty much constantly. The flying on the ground
Yeah,
line.
it's good. And to something that you're speaking to about the production of the track, that's something that I think is really well done on a lot of his new music is even though that amorphous androgynous thing didn't really pan out, the kind of Pink Floyd-esque production on some of
Mhm.
his newer stuff is really good, like the string sections and
Yeah.
the kind of psychedelic like overtones that just kind of live on stuff, I think is really cool. I think like the palette in which he creates music now is really cool. Even if he
Yeah.
doesn't always like knock it out of the park with the song, I think that the palette that he's working with is like really pleasant to listen to.
I agree, and
Um,
I think maybe he did take some lessons from that amorphous androgynous experience. I think there were two songs on whatever record that was that were kind of leftovers from those sessions that do sound pretty different from the rest of the album, and they sound really good. They have that same kind of Noel hookiness to them. I think it's the Mexican and another one I can't remember the name of. Uh, but they do sound a little more psychedelic, and the textures are really interesting and very not Noel like. But I think he did kind of work to include those in later songs and later albums, even if he couldn't quite, make the next Dark Side of the Moon, which was a pretty ballsy thing to try and do in the first place.
yeah, that's
I
kind of
mean,
a ridiculous aspiration, to be honest. I think
he shouldn't have
like
said it out loud.
right. So let's kind of like start looking at kind of what, we're talking a lot about Noel and what he's doing now. I want to talk a little bit about Liam because I think that, he's kind of more current like with his restart, like he had
Mhm.
some downtime where he wasn't doing anything and by his own words kind of was thinking that he wasn't ever going to do anything.
Right.
And in the past 3 or 4 years, he's put out 2 solo records. The first of which is As You Were in 2017. And, when this record came out, I was like so stoked for it because I was like, what? I mean, how is he even putting out a record? Because I know that
Right.
his brother wrote all the
Yeah.
songs.
Like who
Um,
put this album together?
and yeah, and my, I think my first listen on that record, I was kind of floored because you can tell that it's super overproduced to a degree.
Mhm.
Um, and that kind of turned me off a little bit. But again, the more I kind of listened, the more I kind of appreciated the angle in which it was approached. Because it is effectively producers and writers
Mhm.
listening to Oasis
Mhm.
and Noel Gallagher, his brother, listening to his brother's writing style and then completely copying it,
Yeah.
right? And modernizing it to a degree as far as production techniques and sounds,
Yeah.
again having great musicians, just everything about the sounds of the records are really cool. But I just find it so interesting that actually there are just writers and musicians and producers in this world that can just literally take someone's soul and just rip it off, And then it works because you've got Liam, who was the
Yeah.
original singer of those types of songs anyway, singing
Yeah,
them.
it feels like a natural fit, right? They just kind of repurposed Noel through an army of songwriters and did it really successfully, and it sounds good.
Yeah, it's like if you did that same exact technique, but you just took a random no-name killer singer and put them in, it wouldn't work.
Right.
Everyone would be
But
like,
I
"You're
blew
a
it.
ripoff. You're
Yeah.
ripping off Oasis," and it's like, well, how is Liam ripping off his own band?
Yeah. You
But
can't
but
rip yourself off. You can rip your brother off, but like maybe no one's gonna notice because it just sounds like Oasis.
yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing about it is like no one really understands this backstory. They don't really know who the songwriter. People don't think like that. They just go, "Oh, I like the song or I don't like the song." They don't really worry about who wrote the song or, you know, if they fought about it or how the credits get divvied out. So it's really interesting that it's almost like this 1 in a million chance that he could even succeed in this way, right? It had to be this certain scenario. I think it's like parts of what you were saying where it's like he's singing about his brother or the
Mhm.
stories of Oasis. He's effectively singing songs that sound like Oasis again. It's that we're at a place in the world where you have these producers and writers that can do such a quality
Mhm.
job of taking the essence of what something was and really doing it well. I mean, you know, honestly, I think that his records sound so much better than the Oasis records. It's like I kind of would rather listen to them,
You mean from
you
like an
know?
engineering standpoint or just like the new song writing?
I would say, I mean, obviously the songs aren't better than like the original,
Right.
like Live Forever, Don't Look Back in Anger,
Sure.
that kind of stuff. Like they're not better than those songs. But I think that because the engineering's so good, the mixing's so good, the
Yeah.
musicianship is so good, the way Liam's captured is so good, all of those things really
Right.
they create this amalgamation that really makes me think that the records are on par with those Oasis records,
Yeah,
even
and I think
though
there's
it's not
probably
one to
some
one.
degree of yeah, and there's probably some degree of nostalgia playing in there, I think, because I agree with you. When I listen to As You Were, I kind of have at first a feeling where I'm like, oh, I don't know about this. Like, what's the big song from that album? Wall of Glass. Like my first listen to Wall of Glass, I was like, okay, this sounds like an Oasis song. But then a couple of days later, it's still stuck in my head. I'm like, okay, it's tickling the same pleasure centers as Oasis did because it's like the same kind of shit. And yet it's updated for 2021 from like a technological standpoint. It sounds like it was produced in a really nice studio with really good musicians. Like you said, somehow Liam's voice has been captured incredibly. He sounds as good, if not better, today than he did back in the 90s. So it just feels like an updated version of Oasis for the modern era in a really enjoyable way.
Totally. I mean, it's, and I think both Liam and Noel benefit from these modern, these kind of modern constructs. They benefit from the production, the engineering, the mixing. They benefit from musicianship. I mean, not to say that it's funny that I'm saying this. It's like, there weren't great musicians back in the day. Of course there were, but based on just the way kind of technology has advanced in terms of learning, there are so many younger people that are so good, they're so proficient
Hmm.
at something, especially in this scenario where you say, hey, we just want you to play guitar like that sounds like Oasis. Like, oh, well, I grew up listening to
Do
that. And so
that.
it's easy. It's like this thing. And which I failed to mention at the beginning of the show, but you actually have played in an Oasis cover band, right?
I have, and I actively do. We are playing our third show, January 2022. We have like a cover band that plays mostly the first couple albums. We play like every 3 or 4 years, which is a very, very rare concert schedule.
Yeah.
But yeah, so most of my knowledge of early Oasis comes from having played these like same 2025 songs and learning them pretty in depthly.
Yeah.
It's been fun. It's interesting, and I think that going back to those songs now, kind of to the point again of these Liam songs being updated for 2021, it makes me think of there's a trend right now in video games of remastering games from the 90s. And
Yeah.
what people keep saying about remastering these games is they're being remastered to reflect the way these games are in your mind. Like if you went back and played a game from 95, you'd be like, this looks like shit. If you play the remastered version, you're playing what you kind of remember that game being incorrectly. And I feel like that's sort of what these new Liam songs are like. They are what Oasis from the 90s sounds like in your mind.
In your mind.
And then you go
Dude.
back to these
Yeah.
90s songs and you're like, oh, these like sound like shit from like a sonic standpoint.
Yeah. Dude, you're a good podcaster. That's a really good analogy you just made because I'm actually kind of I'm in the video game world too, so all these like Final Fantasy has had this crazy run of updates.
Yep.
They're still like these 8-bit or 16-bit looking games, but it's like you're saying there, it's not about changing something so that it's like it's got crazy graphics and it looks, like some new beautiful experience. It's more about, like you're saying, emulating like something that feels better like currently, but it evokes the exact nostalgia that you got from when you originally played it. And I think you're totally right. And something that
Right.
I didn't really think about that, but it's very psychological in why this stuff
Hmm.
is succeeding is because it's doing that. It's evoking the thing that you loved about it in the beginning, and you don't really notice that it sounds better or worse. You don't really think of it that way until you go do, what I call comparative listening. If you listen
Hmm.
to the Supersonic, like Rock and Roll Star and Live Forever and all those songs off
Yeah.
Definitely Maybe, they are a fucking shit show.
They
Like,
are sludgy as fuck. Yeah.
yeah, and it took them a long time to get that record made because they kept getting different engineers and different
Hmm.
producers, and the label people weren't happy with it. And I think there was at a point where Noel said, I don't care, just put out whatever we made, which is so like, how could you be nonchalant about your very first release on a major label record deal? It's like,
Because they're the Gallagher brothers, man. They don't give a shit.
yeah, they
That's
don't
the whole
care.
thing. Yeah, that's one of the things from listening back to Definitely Maybe. Who was this the producer of the first two or three? I think they keep the same guy for a little while, right?
Yeah, Owen Morris, I think, is
One Morris.
is the person that's credited as who really kind of brought it together. He kind of
Right.
took these different things from different sessions and kind of made it work. And he's credited on What's the Story Morning Glory too, which is probably one of the most massive records of all time.
Yeah, and so that's what I
It's
wanted to talk about for a second. I think it's really interesting going from Definitely Maybe to What's the Story, because to me, even though they have similar kind of production qualities, they're pretty different records. The first one is like very anthem rock heavy. To me, it feels like, as we already mentioned, it's pretty like sludgy in terms of engineering. Like it just sounds like this massive wall of sound and like distorted, overdriven guitars. And I feel like Oasis at this point, maybe due to their drumming not being that great, they just pick a beat and they would just like hammer that beat for 3.5 minutes, and
right.
there's no dynamic range to anything. Maybe the best representation of that is the song Columbia, that's like 6.5 minutes of this like disco beat, and like a tambourine comes in every now and then goes away, and it's fun, but it's like, what is this? And then they get to What's the Story Morning Glory, and their two biggest songs, the two most massive Oasis songs ever, maybe, are Champagne Supernova and Wonderwall, and they're both acoustic ballads. And then Don't Look Back in Anger is a piano ballad.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dynamic that they shifted there somehow.
Yeah, I know that the first record, the reason that it sounds the way it sounds is because they were trying to capture what the band sounded like live, right? Like the reason they
Fair.
got signed, the reason everybody loved them in 94 was because they just had this sound on stage, and they could never get it captured basically. And so
Right.
definitely maybe just ended up being kind of the best they could do to capture that live sound. I think once that kind of did well, I think that kind of when a band does well and then they kind of advance in like how they do studio recordings, they have access to better studios or maybe better engineers and that kind of thing, you can actually kind of think about the intricacies, the nuances of your songwriting a little bit more.
Yeah.
Where that everyone's first record, most people's first record is like a stage banging. You know what I mean? It's like, we're a band, we wrote this in the room, and this is what it feels like. Almost no one's second record ever sounds like that first record.
Because the
Be-
first record, you've probably been playing these songs live for 4 years. So like all you have to record is these songs that you've been playing live. So you just take them straight to the studio and capture whatever that magic was.
exactly. And I think on the second record, obviously the follow up was only a year later.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure that a lot of those songs were written, kind of maybe some of them were even written during the Definitely Maybe sessions, or they were playing some of those out at their shows live before they even did that first record. It's a possibility.
Right.
Um, so I think that, maybe some of those slower tunes, maybe those are tunes that Noel was playing in the bus or in the van, writing that just weren't these big rockers, but you can tell like he's such a melodic songwriter that, and he's effectively an acoustic guitar player.
Mhm.
he plays some leads and stuff, but I mean, I kind of really relate with him. I think this is kind of where I get this, but like I am an acoustic guitar player,
Yeah, you get
right?
the
It's
idea, and I do the same thing. I think he probably writes every single song he writes at first on the acoustic guitar, and then they take it to the band in the Oasis days and find a way to either boost it up to anthem level for like the big rockers, or they just kind of add all of the strings and the bells and whistles to make it feel more anthemic. But yeah, it all starts out super basic and acousticy, and I think he could play almost every song that he's written on an acoustic guitar, and it would sound good in that
yeah.
way as well.
And actually, if you get on the internet and just start browsing, you will find Noel doing every song, even
Oh,
songs
there
that
you go.
Liam sang, acoustic and all these different,
Yeah.
BBC radio sessions. And there's some really killer versions of songs out there from him that have great recordings. And, all of that stuff is interesting too. I mean, I really got down a rabbit hole. Like when I first, reached out to you to do this, I was so fired up about it because I don't know what it was. I saw something, a video or something, and I just kind of started going down that rabbit hole. And I realized like I want to talk about this because of the impact that it had on me
Hmm.
as a musician, as a producer, as a songwriter, all these things like I've always like given so much credit to the grunge scene. I've given so much credit to Kurt Cobain and Chris Cornell and these people that they did have a massive impact on me. But when I really think about the emotive, like evocation, like
Hmm.
I think it came from Oasis. Like, definitely maybe
You're doing
came,
some pretty deep psychoanalysis as part of this podcast.
I mean, I kind of do deep psychoanalysis of everything. That's just kind of how I am.
Now
But
it's just being podcasted. Yeah.
yeah, but in 94, I was born in 82, so I was 12 years old. I mean, when you're 12, like that's music kind of starts to get on your radar
Sure.
around that age when you start to become a teenager. Um,
Yeah, I was going
what
to ask you about your early Oasis experience. Like, were you on the Oasis train in the Definitely Maybe era, or was it a little bit later?
Definitely maybe era. I mean, I remember hearing Live Forever. There was a lot of stuff happening in 94. I mean, a lot of stuff. There was Green Day, I think, was out in 94. There
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
The Offspring. There was all that kind of era. There was like this, the origin of the pop punk era was happening. Grunge rock was happening. It was in full fledged. Then you
Right.
had this kind of Oasis thing that was in the mix on the radio with all that stuff, which is
Yeah.
crazy. I mean,
Yeah, and
think
it's
about
interesting to
that.
think about this. Like, so you were born in '82. I was born in '85, so I'm only 3 years younger than you. But that means that I was 9 versus you being 12 when all this stuff was happening.
Yeah,
So like this all just completely went over my head because I was a 9-year-old. But
right.
like when you're 12, you're actually kind of right at the right age to have this stuff actually make an impact on you and be listening to what's out there. I remember being in 5th grade and having friends like singing Champagne Supernova like in the hallways and stuff. I remember that.
Wow.
Uh, but I was still such a little kid that like it didn't make much difference to me. I listened to whatever my parents put on the radio at that point, which was like country and oldies. So it
Uh-huh.
wasn't until like way later, and especially doing this Oasis cover band project, that I really got a chance to dig into this stuff. So it's like a much later evolution for me.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think for me, I think I've come to this realization or I've convinced myself of this, one or the other, but it's like I think that Oasis probably had the most fundamental and a fundamental impact on me of any band, any band,
That's big.
like even more than the Beatles, which is a blasphemy to say,
I
but
can't
it's
believe you're saying it.
I didn't know who the Beatles were in
Yeah.
94. Like you just kind of said that was something that's interesting that I didn't know, but I didn't grow up with like the Beatles and rock and roll. My dad's a carpenter. I would go down to his wood shop and he'd have top 40 country on. That was what I
There you
listened to.
go.
I
Yeah, me
mean,
too. So
like
I kind of assumed you did grow up with that stuff based on kind of the Deke persona.
yeah, no, I mean, I think if some, I bet Garth Brooks had more of an impact on me than probably anything in rock and roll. I think when I
That
was
might be our
really
biggest overlap then, Deke. I listened to a buttload of Garth Brooks as a kid.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I think one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about this is because I think we share some of these melodic and structural sense when it comes to songwriting, production, arrangements, how a melody is delivered and that kind of stuff. I think that we really share, some similarities in how we think about that stuff. And I think it's an Oasis style thinking.
For sure.
I mean, they don't, there's no Well, I guess there are some songs where they just kind of mess around, but for the most part, they get to the point. It's like,
They're tight pop songs. Yeah, they're tightly constructed.
right. It's like, here's a verse that could be a chorus.
Yeah,
You know, here's the chorus, which is incredible. Here's a post chorus that's better
yeah.
than the chorus.
And
It's
here's like
like,
10 more hooks just for fun. Like, enjoy these hooks.
right. And we're going to throw a piano melody in that's never going to get out of your head. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's when you think about stuff like that now, you think about, modern pop, you think about, Billie Eilish and Katy Perry and all this that kind of world. But it's like Oasis was doing that thing in a format of a classic rock band effectively
Mhm.
in 94. And, they're not bubblegum by any means, but, my version of pop is the Beatles. It's like the
Yeah.
Beatles are pop music. I mean, they were the pop of the 60s, but it's something that is, in my mind, is delivering melodic hooks and, arrangements that evoke kind of an emotion behind those melodic hooks. And I think Oasis does that probably better than anybody from that era.
And it feels like almost unfairly, like that whole kind of setup went out of fashion at some point. Like for a long time in the bands that I've been in and my own songwriting, people ask you like, what genre of music do you make? Which is such an unfair question. There's no answer to that. Or like, what do you sound like? I don't know what I sound like, but I know what I try and do. And it's exactly what you just described, which is just like memorable melodies, catchy hooks, like tight pop songs, everything done with intention, things along that line, rather than kind of like long, meandering, experimental type stuff. I don't know what genre that is, but it's what Oasis is doing too. And it feels like around like 2000, what they were doing maybe was not like cool anymore for a little bit. Although in a sense, Oasis is very evergreen. Like what they're doing should apply forever and be enjoyable to everyone forever. And I think that that's kind of becoming clear at this point. But like by the time I was in college, I think they were releasing Standing on the Shoulders of Giants in 2000. I mean, I wasn't in college yet, but like there's a long blank spot for me in Oasis where I was not paying any attention to it. But going back and listening to those albums now, I appreciate them just as much as the earlier stuff, the songs that I like on there, because it's the same thing. Like the song Lila, I'd never heard before somehow.
Oh,
That
wow.
song's incredible. I love it.
Yeah.
And like that will be one I'm listening to for the next 6 months because this is like a new Oasis song for me.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean they were consistent. They kept hammering on this same setup and did it really well for a really long time, which is cool.
Yeah, totally. And I think honestly that's what people want of a band. Unfortunately, I think that,
Yeah.
these bands that try to reinvent themselves a lot of times, with the exception of Radiohead, fail miserably at that because
See a
once
lot of
you've
pushback.
well, yeah, once you've identified yourself as something, people just want that over and over. And so I think smartly, they did that. I really don't have a problem with that as long as the songwriting is good. What I don't like is when somebody rips themselves off, but they don't have any other perspective to add, right? It's like,
Right.
you know, I wouldn't say that like all of their, even though like we said that like their songs are kind of like trying to do Don't Look Back in Anger over and over, there's always, it's not like they're ripping off their melodies, like they're writing new melodies that are
Mhm.
still good. They're still like, they're still memorable. And I think that it's this fine line, something else I wanted to talk about was like, there's these bands that are derivative, right? We're kind of in this era right now. Like it's the same thing with video games. It's like, or movies, like we're trying to recreate all the stuff that everybody liked.
Right.
Right. And bands are doing the same thing. So there's all these derivative bands. Actually, you posted something about going to see Dawes play the other day.
Mhm.
And I love the first two Dawes records that were produced by Jonathan Wilson in Laurel Canyon I love those records. I love them. I love the way they sound. I love the songwriting, the singing, and they're so derivative. They sound like Jackson
Sure.
Browne. They sound like, all of that era,
Easy
early
listening
70s.
soft rock. Yeah.
But they do it so well and they do it with an angle that makes it feel authentic, right? And I think Dawes does that very well. And I think Oasis also did that very well.
Yeah, and I think bands like that, if we're looking at Oasis as being derivative of, say, the Beatles, or Dawes being derivative of the 70s and Jackson Browne, I think maybe that's okay because they're repackaging this for a completely different generation, right? I mean, I'm never going to be able to see the Beatles, but I can go see Oasis. I won't be able to see Jackson Browne, but I can see Dawes and kind of enjoy the same vibe and musicianship. In both of these cases, the Dawes musicians are like second to none in terms of how good they are at doing what they do. So
Absolutely.
it's an extremely enjoyable live experience, and not one that I could really replicate by going back to the 70s.
Yeah, that's another interesting point that I think is more like social psychology, which is that in a way, these, especially these more successful, say derivative, and I'm using that a little bit loosely, but like in a way, they're actually carrying the torch of that legacy, right? I think that
Really.
part of me wants to just crucify, anybody that is a ripoff.
Yeah.
I want to say like, can't you come up with something original? Can't you do something unique? But at the same time, maybe from a zoomed out perspective over a long period of time, the legacy of something like Jackson Brown may live on through a band like Dawes,
Yeah. It's
or
hard to
like
be original.
yeah, it is hard, and I think that the trick is to do it in an authentic way, right? Is to
Yeah.
actually understand the essence of something, and you're able to create something in that space with that essence without actually like stealing their melodies or stealing their, you know,
Right.
I think that's where I draw the line is like, don't just steal somebody's stuff, understand them so well that you're able to kind of work in that space.
And I've got a great counterexample for you of someone who's doing this wrong, and it's probably off your radar, but Olivia Rodrigo, who is like one of the biggest streaming artists right now. She's like a teen pop sensation. She had Driver's License last year, which was like billions and billions of streams. She has had to give out writing credits to a lot of artists from a lot of different genres from the past like 20 years. Like they've all come calling to be like, "Hey, Olivia, we like the song, but like you clearly ripped me off." And she's like, "You're right. Like here's the credit."
Yeah.
And so she's just doling out writing credits. And I think maybe she does write some of her own songs, but she's working with a team of pop writers, and she's repurposing songs that were already very popular and kind of reselling them back to people in 2021. And the songs are enjoyable. I mean, for the same reasons the originals were, but it doesn't feel like an authentic recreation or an authentic attempt at making something new, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on where it's like because you have so many different kind of machines moving at the same time. You have an industry machine that's effectively just trying to make money, and then up and coming musicians and songwriters and stuff, they're just trying to get on the ride. Like how
Yeah,
do I get
yeah,
on that ride? How do I become famous or
sure.
whatever? And I think, and unfortunately, I think what falls to the wayside is the artistic part of that. I think even somebody like Dawes, I mean, they can sell small rooms, but I don't, they're not going to become like the next, big hit band. I think that,
We're not in danger of breaking out. No.
yeah, I think that, and even they are trying to do things that, are a little more experimental for them, I
Mhm,
think, than what they did in the early days.
sure.
Um, but, I think with getting it back to Oasis and kind of them being a derivative band, I think they are like maybe one of the first super derivative bands to succeed. Like they just stole from the Beatles effectively, right? Like
Yeah,
you listen to
sure.
these certain ways that melodies play out in the songs, like small like tailing runs or the way the piano walks move in an arrangement, and you're like, oh, that's Let It Be, that's Hey Jude, or that's whatever. In the case of Liam Gallagher, he says flat up, I am trying to sound like John Lennon.
Oh yeah, yeah, and he does a very good job of it. I mean, he
Yeah,
sounds just like, and they use a lot of the same sort of, I think, transitional chords. What I think of is the Oasis chords, which are that E minor seventh and the A suspended. That they're all over
right.
everything,
Yeah,
and Beatles use those too. I mean, but you just don't think about it because Oasis packages these in giant anthem rock songs,
right.
whereas the Beatles didn't.
Right. There wasn't giant anthem rock during the
Right.
Beatles era. I mean, anthem rock didn't even start until probably 70. In the early 70s, the Beatles were done by 70.
Well,
So
maybe
it,
that's something to think about too. Like maybe in terms of being a derivative band, until the Beatles came along, like what would you be derivative of? Like maybe the Oasis was the first band to like have the opportunity to look back at something and actually try and pull from it.
I mean,
Um,
this is probably too deep to go, but I mean, really the Beatles were the derivative band because, Paul McCartney effectively would take something like Little Richard, and then
that's true.
he would write like Lady Madonna, or he has so many influences. Bob Dylan was such a big influence on those guys. When you think of something like, Hide Your Love Away or whatever, like
Yeah, yeah.
the Beatles were taking all these styles from the 50s, from the 40s, even. You think of something like Martha, My Dear, it's like, show tunes effectively. They were
True.
they were taking all of these different genres, but they did it better than anybody because they made it so uniquely theirs
Yeah.
that you don't really point at them and go, "Oh, hey, you're ripping off Elvis there," right? Or you're ripping
Yeah,
off
they
whatever,
hit the paper trail pretty well, so it feels like something totally new. Whereas Oasis was pretty upfront about it. They, like you said, they even say it. Like they're not going to pretend like it's not the case. They're like, yeah, these are Beatles songs.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So there's a couple other things I want to hit on quickly, which is, um, there's all these like different guitar player channels on YouTube and stuff. Some that I watch, people like Rhett Scholl, or there's these really cool channels with this kind of music. And I noticed that like Wonderwall is used like a meme almost.
Yeah. It actually is one of the original memes, I think. If you go to whatsyourmeme.com or whatever it is that catalogs memes, Wonderwall is one of the main ones. And
Wow.
I don't pretend to really understand it. I think the idea is that it's like everyone who sits in the hallway of their college dorm and plays an acoustic guitar, if they know nothing else, they know Wonderwall because like that's the one that people recognize. That's the one that's gonna like get you girls, like all the most ridiculous shit.
Dude, I picked up so many girls on River Street in Savannah playing Wonderwall. Like, I would like make so much money just like, just sitting out there with a guitar case. Yeah.
Dude, you're the meme. You're exactly the meme. You embody it.
It's so interesting, like that a song like that, it's like because of popularity, because of how easy it is to play. There's all these different factors that do that. But I think it really shows how timeless the songwriting is.
Hmm.
It's like another notch to me, even though it's grossly disgusting. Like what, even what meme culture is, I don't understand it at all. But, the fact that Wonderwall has made its way into like household vocabulary almost,
Yeah.
you think of it that way, like almost anybody knows what Wonderwall is. I mean,
Yeah, and it's weird, and I don't. It's one of these songs that I hate when a song gets run into the ground so much that I hate it, and that hasn't happened with Wonderwall, which I think also speaks to its timelessness. I'm speaking personally, I guess. Maybe people do hate Wonderwall. I very much like Wonderwall,
yeah.
and I recognize that it's a meme, but somehow it's been able to withstand being ridiculed as a meme for so long because there's really nothing to ridicule. It's just a popular, good song. It's a
Right.
victim of its own popularity, if anything.
Right, right. And I think, it's the same reason why a lot of people hate like Money by Pink Floyd. It's like because it's been on the radio for,
Yeah.
so many years and it gets overplayed.
There's nothing inherently hateable about it. You've just heard it too many times.
Exactly. And I think Wonderwall suffers from that. But again, it's like, it's not suffering. It's just that you've sold billions of copies.
Right.
You've made like an impact in that way. And I think like it's interesting looking at them from that perspective of this like massive empire or this, this brand. But for me personally, I think that that's not really how I think of them. I think of them as this emotive, like foundational experience for me where, I'm thinking like when What's the Story came out, I was 94. So I remember it came out the summer that I was about to go to boarding school.
Oh wow.
And I was leaving all my friends, and it was this like emotional distress, and I was just like not Wonderwall, but Don't Look Back in Anger was like on repeat.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hear any other music. I just wanted to hear that song, and I just played it over and over, and
And
it
that
was
probably
like,
speaks to the role of nostalgia in this a little bit. Like, if you still enjoy this album that much, it's probably partly because of the role that it played in your life at that point.
yeah, totally. I think that those songs and stuff, but I think what transcends that is how I feel about what they do now, which is like,
Mhm.
because there's things that I can look back and go, oh, that, I also liked Goldfinger a lot. It's not, I don't
I did
like,
too.
I don't go listen to like Goldfinger and say like, man, these guys are really like pushing the needle. And, I think that,
I don't know, man. I ran to Here in Your Bedroom the other day, and it was pretty enjoyable.
yeah, that song, that was a big song for me. Here in Your Bedroom was a good one. I
Yep.
wasn't like super into that pop punk world, but I mean, I have I think I've even mentioned this to you before, but sometimes I think that like Green Day is the modern day Beatles because
Mhm.
they just everything they do is like so perfect, like
Yep.
hooks and melodies and all that.
Yep. They
Um,
got it down.
yeah, and but I think that Oasis, like they not only have their own legacy, but they are extending that legacy of the British sound as a whole,
Hmm.
and honestly, I think, you wouldn't have Coldplay without Oasis.
Yeah, and I think Coldplay at some point has acknowledged that to a certain extent. But yeah, it feels like Britpop as a whole was supposed to have died, I guess, with the advent of like Spice Girls and Teeny Boppers and Backstreet Boys and stuff. But it's almost like Oasis just kind of ignored that Britpop died and just kind of kept doing it.
Yeah.
So, 20 years later, they're still making more or less the same style of music, and it's still there if you want it, which is cool.
Yeah, totally. And one of my favorite bands, Elbow. I mean, every time they put out a record, it's number one in the UK, and it's like,
Yeah.
and I look at that and I go, hey, there's two things I take away from that. One is that people in the UK aren't dumbasses like people in America. They actually
Totally true.
appreciate really good artistic music. And two, Oasis paved the way for that.
And if you
I
look at those that footage from the Liam documentary, the stadiums that he was still selling out in 2017, like I don't think that would happen in the U.S. I don't know what his tour has been like over here if he's even had one, but like the number of people that are showing up and enthusiastically singing along to Liam songs in 2017 shows that there's still something working over there.
Yeah, and I think he finally, that's something we didn't bring up, which I want to point out is that Liam and Noel haven't spoken in almost 15 years.
Yeah, that's
You know,
crazy.
it's really sad. That was actually a whole talking point that I kind of forgot about. It's like you have a brother
Hmm.
that's a little bit younger, right?
I got two younger ones. Yeah.
Oh, but you played in a band with one of your brothers.
I played in a couple of bands with one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like an interesting thing. Like, I mean, I'm assuming you don't hate your brother and you speak to him.
No, it would be like talk about a grudge. I don't even understand it. Like to not
Yeah,
talk to your brother for 15 years based on, I mean, not every brother pair has like the world's biggest band breaking up
right.
underpinning their friendship,
Yeah.
but it is wild to think about, especially now that they've been outside of Oasis for as long as they have been. Like we are well past that. They have different careers, they have different families. Like it's almost unfathomable that they have not been able to patch this up by now. But I guess that's what the Gallaghers do.
Yeah, I think it speaks to being like lost in ego. It really speaks to
Yeah.
that. And I think to Liam's credit to some degree, he seems like he wants a relationship with his brother and he wants their families to, he wants his kids to, I don't know. It seems like that.
He didn't want to
Um,
quite say it out loud, but yeah, I agree. I kind of got that impression as well.
yeah, I think that it's Noel's the one that quit the band and took his songs with him. He basically said, "I'm out of the band and I'm taking all my songs," which is all of them.
Yeah.
And has also been the person to say, "Look, I don't need you. I don't want to, do that." And it's sad, just as a human being, it's like, man, try to rise above what this is in some way. Find something, even if it's behind the scenes and you guys want to keep playing We Hate Each Other in the public,
Yeah, it's like,
cool. But
guys, you're almost 50. Like, there's just no reason to keep doing this. Like, wouldn't you rather be friends in old age and have your families know each other
yeah,
than like kind of just continue this bullshit for that much longer?
yeah. So that kind of, it like hurts my heart just as a human being. It's like you think about people, even people that are seemingly total assholes. It's like, I wish that I wish they could figure this out because there's nothing worse than like making some brilliant art that affects people and then not being able to appreciate it with the people you made it with.
Yeah.
Like because those are the only people that get it. They're the only people that really get that experience that you had, and it's pretty sad that that's kind of the course it's taken for them. But hey, maybe it's the fuel that makes them continue to do what they're doing, which is putting out cool music. I mean,
It seems to be. I mean, what do we think the likelihood is of Oasis reunion in 5 years? What if they do make up and they're like, you know what, we're getting the band back together?
I don't think that'll ever happen, but I think that, Liam now is in his concerts, he's playing Oasis songs, but he was never legally allowed to do that. They just recently, I guess, were able to negotiate through Noel or the record labels or something, the ability for him to actually perform the songs, which
That's interesting.
that is interesting. And I think it's also another like reason why Liam's doing well as far as touring is concerned,
Play Oasis.
because he can do Oasis songs where,
Yeah, there's that clip in one of those interviews in the documentary where Noel is being interviewed, and they're saying like, "Hey Noel, so you played some new solo stuff, you played some Oasis stuff," and he's like, "Yeah, I played my songs." which
Yeah.
is like, oh,
I know. It's like, what's the most dickheadish way I can answer this question? It's
yeah,
like,
like,
yes, you
ooh,
you did everything. Yeah, it's like an egomaniac to the nth degree, but it's comical. It really
it
is
is.
comical
It's
to
too
watch it. It's
much.
just like how can you maintain this level of just
Yeah.
arrogance towards everything, you know?
I think that brings us to a good kind of keep the antagonism going final question to me, which is the one you asked at the beginning: who is making the best music right now? Like at this moment in time, is it Liam or Noel who is really putting out the best output?
I think my vote's for Liam.
I was going to say that too. And I didn't think I was going to say that coming into getting ready for this conversation because I am much more familiar with High Flying Birds. I followed them, I've listened to all the records. And Liam, I really hadn't listened to, but his is more interesting to me for some reason.
I agree. I think I felt the same way. It's like I've been such a Noel fan, and I think it's him specifically that had the impact on me because
Hmm.
of his writing. Obviously, it's his writing that I think is the most important aspect of their band. But I think if you're just looking at taking it at face value, right now, Liam's stuff is just it's better.
Hmm. Or
It's
maybe it's
more
just not as,
compelling.
it's more compelling, maybe because it's a little bit different. I feel like Noel is just still, like, I think he has reached peak Noel Gallagher. I
Yeah.
think he has fully embodied who he was going to be and like fulfilled his potential. But I guess Liam just had more room to grow, maybe. So it feels like what he's doing is more interesting and he's being more creative with it.
Yeah, something that my girlfriend Sarah said is that his songs now sound super youthful.
Hmm.
And that was an interesting
True.
thing too. It's like, you know why? Because they are youthful. He's not been writing songs for 30 years like his brother has.
Yeah.
He's written a couple, but his approach to the songs is a lot more young. It's just it actually is more young because he hasn't explored that space nearly as much as Noel has.
Yeah. Noel, as we have seen, has got a great formula, but he is uncomfortable getting out of his box too much. And Liam just didn't have a box yet. Like he's creating it as we speak, and it's pretty cool so far.
Yeah, and he's doing it with the trust of like other people, which I think is a,
Yeah.
a really good way to approach it because you're not solely trapped into what you're able to come up with, which Noel
Yeah.
kind of is.
Yeah.
Because
Because he's unwilling to work with anybody else.
that's right. I think that he's going to be a lot more. He probably shuts down ideas more than Liam does because Liam's like, well, I've always been taking direction from someone,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the ultimate irony that like Noel kind of took his book of songs and left in a huff and was like, "I'll be fine on my own." But really, like Liam's got more potential here at this point.
yeah, it's kind of exciting to think about. I mean, if anything, I'm just glad that they're both putting out music that I can potentially, enjoy. And for me personally, it's like their records sound really good. They've got cool engineering. They're working with interesting producers.
Yeah,
And so there's that aspect to dig into. It's like not only now am I going to get to hear these cool songwriters and what they're doing now, but like I get to actually enjoy it where I'm at, right? As opposed
yeah,
to
yeah.
that nostalgia where it's like, well, the
Right.
record sounded bad, but I was like in love with the songs. Or now it's like I get kind of both worlds,
Yeah,
these cool songwriting, adventures that they're going on, and kind of inspecting them as a producer and an engineer, and kind of figuring out what they're all about.
yeah. Young Deke going to boarding school had one reaction to Oasis, and then professional producer Deke has a very different one to current Oasis members, which is cool. They've kept
Yeah,
this going for a really long time, and they give you content to enjoy over the course of what 25, 30 years. How long has it been at this point?
I mean, in 1994 is when they basically were discovered and put out their first record. So almost 30 years.
30
It's like,
years.
yeah. But and it seems like that at least Liam is connecting with a younger audience. I think that
Hmm.
that's kind of an interesting take too. I mean, that there are I don't know if Noel is really connecting with a younger audience. I think that Liam is doing that better.
I was
Um,
shocked to see that footage from the Liam documentary of the like 13 and 14-year-olds at his shows.
yeah,
Because I guess I think that's probably another UK versus US thing. I doubt he would have that draw over here. But it
right.
seems like he's much more of an institution recognized over there where, parents who now have 13-year-olds because they've been around for 30 years are like, hey, you got to go see Liam Gallagher because like mommy and daddy really liked Oasis. And they're like, cool.
Well, yeah, and I mean, people my age do have kids that are,
Yeah.
teenagers and older even, and I think that like, it's not even that their parents are actively trying to get them into it, but they might have grown up listening to that in the
Yeah.
household, and so it's similar to this kind of, we grew up listening to Garth
I
Brooks.
was going to say, yeah. Oasis is their Garth Brooks.
I think that is a great spot to end on. That
Yeah.
Oasis has become someone's Garth Brooks, and
Is that the takeaway? If that's the takeaway, this was successful.
yeah, let's leave it at that. I think like leaving on that note is very interesting. So, Lewis, dude, this was like really fun. I had a great time talking to you about this.
Me too. We could do it all day. I think we've covered a lot of good Oasis ground. I'm sure there's more to cover, but that was productive.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much, man. And I hope we get to do something like this in the future.
Yeah, let's keep it going.
Sweet.
Later, man.
All right, I'm gonna